an alcoholic as a result of his sorrows and neurotic state, and he hinted at a darker cause. I'll explain in detail later. But nothing had changed. Where Vincent saw entente and rededication, Gauguin saw appeasement and delay. What Vincent took as a change of heart, Gauguin meant only as a recalculation. If he could maintain good relations in Paris and avoid an explosion in Arles by staying, Gauguin reckoned, he could bear life with Vincent a little longer. I am staying put, he confided to Schiffenecker, but my departure is always imminent. To Theo, Vincent reported that all had returned to normal in the Yellow House. This is how things stand, he wrote cheerfully. Gauguin was saying to me this morning when I asked him how he felt, that he felt his old self coming back, which gave me enormous pleasure.
Is it working?
But in fact, he knew the truth. Even as he boasted of a new rapprochement and claimed Gauguin as an excellent friend, he continued to fear the worst. Up to the last days, he later confessed, I saw only one thing.
Oh my God, it is live. Alrighty.
Oh my God, it is live.
Alrighty.
Oh my God, it is live.
That Gauguin was working with his heart divided between the desire to go to Paris to carry out his plans and the life at Arles. The uncertainty paralyzed him. Despite his claims of unceasing effort, his work ground to a halt. In a collapse of confidence reminiscent of The Hague,
I've never done this
he asked
before.
Theo to return canvases
All
from
I'm trying to
Paris
do is
and
Batik.
proposed not sending
Okay,
any
let's
more
get
for
back.
at least a year. It would certainly be better if I can refrain from sending them, he wrote forlornly.
I'm just
For there is no need to
painting
show
with
them at the moment.
beeswax.
I know that well enough. Still, through all the premonitions of catastrophe, he protested his absolute serenity and confidence in the future. As in Drenthe and Antwerp, the contradiction between his averred life and his real life drove Vincent into a spiral of guilt and self-reproach in the weeks before Christmas, his most vulnerable season. Gauguin undoubtedly saw the first cracks of the coming breakdown in Montpellier when, standing before Delacroix's portrait of Alfred Bruyas, Vincent launched into a bizarre discourse on the family resemblance between the bearded, red-headed Bruyas and himself. In twisted knots of association, he linked both Gauguin and Theo to Rembrandt portraits, creating a delusional brotherhood of lookalikes, and ended with a vision of himself as the brooding, demon-plagued poet Torquato Tasso, as Delacroix famously depicted him, imprisoned in an insane asylum. As much as he could, Vincent hid from Theo the gathering storm in his head. He talked vaguely about difficulties that are rather within ourselves than outside. He complained that his discussions with Gauguin left him as exhausted as an electric battery after it has run down. Only later did he admit to multiple nervous crises and attacks of delirium in the last weeks of December. But even at that time, Theo must have noticed how Vincent's infrequent letters flitted distractedly from subject to subject, from image to image, as restless and disconnected as a ghost. He reported looking at paintings and seeing visions from the past. Delacroix's portrait of Bruyas triggered a particularly vivid reverie, he told Theo. A phantom-like figure from a favorite poem by Alfred de Musset. A wretch clad in black that followed him silently wherever he went, watching as if from the other side of a mirror. My ill-starred brother, clad in gloom, as though arisen from the tomb. Religion, the most toxic of all subjects, had returned. From Musset's resurrected sibling to the Christ-like Tasso, to the man of God Delacroix, Vincent saw the ghosts of his own past in apparitions almost indistinguishable from real life.
So I'm batiking the Queen of
Among the many
Wands
portraits of his
tarot
lost
card
brother
from Tarot.
Louis
Oh, I
that
got
he
it.
saw in
This is a
Montpellier
custom order.
was one
It's on
depicting
an
the gaunt,
XL
red-headed collector posed
100%
as
cotton
Christ with a crown of thorns.
shirt.
Steeling himself against the siege of Gauguin's success, Vincent invoked St. Paul's injunction to be sorrowful yet always rejoicing. He engaged in heated debates with Gauguin that explored the elusive, fraught boundaries between art, religion, delusion, and the supernatural. According to the latter's account, Vincent became so animated and emphatic in these arguments that he scribbled on the wall of the studio in yellow chalk, Je suis Saint-Esprit. I am the Holy Spirit. But no image of alienation or disintegration could have haunted Vincent more than the one in Guy de Maupassant's story, La Horla, the stranger. The obscure Gothic term, taken from Norman dialect, perfectly suited Maupassant's account of a man driven to insanity by hallucinatory visions and paranoid fantasies. Vincent probably read La Horla while still in Paris, but his plan for the combination with Gauguin had no place in it for this dark diary of a mind possessed. The bright future and boundless
Listening
optimism
to
of
Van Gogh
Bellamy better suited his dreams for the Midi. When those dreams began to unravel in December, his thoughts turned to Maupassant's dreadful tale. Gauguin, an admirer of the supernatural, noted the story and its strange title in his sketchbook from Arles, a sign of its influence on their increasingly electrified life in the Yellow House. And Vincent later reported hallucinatory sightings of the Horla itself. Like Vincent, Maupassant's narrator suffered from sleepless nights, attacks of nerves, and strange visions. Over the course of a few months, recorded day by day in excruciating detail, he descends into madness. He comes to distrust his senses and fear his dreams, this perfidious sleep. He imagines himself the unwitting victim of a hypnotist or a sleepwalker, living a mysterious double life. Gradually, he slips from vague unease into paranoid fear, and then into terrifying delirium. He feels the constant presence of a menacing spirit, an invisible being determined to suck the life out of him, then plunge a knife into him while he sleeps. It stalks him like Musset's black-clad wretch, drinking his water at night, turning the pages of his book, stealing his reflection in the mirror. He compares it to the fairies, gnomes, and ghosts of ancient lore, and especially to the most frightening delusion that ever haunted men's minds, the conception of God.
In Batik.
His hallucinatory visions grow stronger and stranger. He sees objects move in midair as if guided by an unseen hand. He feels chained to his chair, unable to escape, an enslaved and terrified spectator at his own undoing. He fights off madness for as long as possible, with the same brave pretense of logic and self-awareness that Vincent used as a bulwark against the disorder in his head. I ask myself whether I am mad, he records in his diary. I certainly should think that I was mad, absolutely mad, if I were not conscious that I knew my state, if I could not fathom it and analyze it with the most complete lucidity. But finally, he succumbs. In a furious attack of paranoia, he tries to kill his invisible tormentor by trapping it in his room and setting fire to the building. When that plot fails, he turns his avenging terror on himself. No, there is no doubt about it, he cries out at the end of the story, vowing to pursue his fight against the Horla to its inevitable conclusion. He is not dead. Then I suppose I must kill myself. In the Yellow House, too, events spiraled out of control. Vehement outbursts of debate punctuated every day. Our arguments are terribly electric, Vincent told Theo. They argued, until our nerves are strained to the point of stifling all human warmth, he lamented. Gauguin tried to diffuse his host's volcanic eruptions by ignoring them, a strategy that Vincent's father had used. But that only made them worse. The repeated explosions left the house charged with tension. The silences between them weighed so heavily that visitors like the postman Horla felt an air of dread even during their truces. Like Maupassant's haunted hero, Vincent seemed at war with himself, seized by titanic passions one minute, brooding or nervous the next. Horrible fits of anxiety alternated with feelings of emptiness and fatigue, he later admitted. Days of exhausting argument were followed by nights of wandering sleeplessness. Gauguin noted the contradictions in Vincent's behavior and saw them as signs of a fierce inner struggle. Vincent has been turning very strange, he reported to Bernard, but fighting it. Years later, Gauguin recalled how suddenly and violently Vincent could change personalities, from excessively abrupt and boisterous to ominously silent, then back again. One minute he cogently made the case why Gauguin should stay in Arles, and fondly laid plans for a joint exhibition. The next, he angrily accused his guest of scheming mischief and hovered suspiciously after Gauguin went to bed, as if fearing a midnight flight. In a fit of mistrust, he seized the Bon's self-portrait that he had given Gauguin as an invitation to the Midi, and rubbed out the dedication, "À mon ami," with paint solvent. Of all the paranoid visions that filled Vincent's head, one terrified him more than any other. Since Gauguin's arrival in Arles, his relations with Theo had changed. Their letters had grown not only shorter and less frequent, but less intimate as well. Theo had warmer words for the two young Dutch artists who were visiting him in Paris than for his distant, troubled brother. He commented pointedly on how their pleasant company had improved life on the Rue Lepic. When the two artists left Paris for the countryside, Theo did not recommend they go to Arles, as Vincent had urged him to do. It was only one of many signs that Theo's confidence in his brother's artistic project had begun to ebb. He seemed genuinely startled when Gauguin finally showed up in Arles, as if he doubted the combination's success all along. After Gauguin arrived, he abandoned the long and rancorous push for Vincent to make saleable work, a push that had defined their relationship for almost a decade. Instead, he sent only patronizing assurances. "The condition I want you to arrive at is that you should never have any worries," and empty blandishments. "You are living like the great ones of the earth," all signaling, it seemed, his acceptance of inevitable failure. "We must see to it that we don't take too much on our shoulders," he wrote, oddly unbothered by Vincent's plan not to send any paintings for a year. "We shall be able to go on for some time to come, even without selling anything." For Gauguin, on the other hand, Theo saw only the brightest future. In letters filled with optimism and accolades, he sent news of Gauguin's grand succès in Paris and reports of more sales. He boldly predicted that Gauguin's reputation would be bigger than anybody had thought, bigger even than Monet's. He praised Gauguin's work not just for its saleability, but for its strange poetry. "Gauguin whispers words of solace for those who are not happy or healthy," he wrote, usurping the language of consolation that Vincent had taught him. "In him, nature itself speaks." But of all the flattery Theo heaped on Gauguin, nothing could have rankled his brother more than this. He could go the same way as Millet. Gauguin responded in kind, sending frequent, often long letters in stark contrast to Vincent's, filled with upbeat reports, courtly gestures, cogent explanations of symbolist theory, and incisive business suggestions. Where Vincent sent no paintings to Paris, Gauguin sent multiple shipments, complete with directions for framing and selling. In one of these batches, he included his mocking portrait of Vincent painting sunflowers, which he grandly presented to Theo as a gift. Theo hailed it as a great work of art and called it the best portrait ever painted of his brother in terms of capturing his inner being. Week after week of lopsided encomiums and unshared letters only intensified the sibling rivalry that had built up through the spring and summer. In the hothouse of paranoia on the Place Lamartine, Vincent's early suspicions that Gauguin was a schemer with political designs on his brother slipped easily into delusions of betrayal. Why, for instance, had Vincent's relations with Bernard come to such an abrupt, mysterious end shortly after his house guest's arrival in Arles? Bernard continued to correspond with Gauguin, but Vincent's letters went strangely unanswered. Would his relations with Theo suffer the same fate? Was Gauguin another Tersteeg, another false brother luring Theo toward the fata morgana of conventional comfort and success? Vincent had welcomed Gauguin as a lost sibling, like Brouillat. Had he unwittingly invited into their lives a stranger who, like Musset's wretch, looked like a brother but brought only despair and ruin? In his attacks of inexplicable dread, every fear seemed plausible. For the first time, he started hoarding Theo's letters, as if clinging to something that he felt slipping away, and eavesdropped suspiciously on Gauguin's correspondence with Paris. Between Theo's upcoming Christmas trip to Holland, which inevitably included a visit with the invidious Tersteeg, and his blithe acceptance of Gauguin's invitation to Arles after years of resisting his brother's entreaties, Vincent could see the outlines of treachery. If Theo would come to the Yellow House for Gauguin, would he abandon it if Gauguin left? Nothing made Vincent feel more disconnected from his family, whether real or imagined, than the coming of Christmas. Like Redlaw in The Haunted Man, Dickens' tale about a Christmas Eve reckoning with a phantom twin, a story that he reread every year, Vincent found nothing but dreaded reflection and regret in the joyful rituals of the season. A season that enveloped Arles starting in early December. Everywhere he turned, he saw plates of Santa Barbe corn on windowsills, one of many local holiday customs that mixed Catholic mysticism with older pagan fertility rites. Soon, meat disappeared from meals and menus, special breads appeared, and desserts multiplied. Decorations of fruit and flowers filled the faded, dusty rooms throughout town, even the infernal Café de la Gare. Then the clashes came out. Every family and business in Arles rehearsed the miraculous birth in little clay figurines called Sainton, for which the Midi was famous. The same scene came to life and burst into song in the pastorale staged at the Folies Alésiennes. These elaborate theatricals, part medieval mystery play, part musical revue, drew thousands to the theater, just as the parade of shepherds playing rustic instruments and leading a spotless lamb drew thousands into the streets, kneeling and crossing themselves as the sacred procession passed. No matter the pageantry and piety outside his window, Vincent's Christmas could never escape the ghosts of the men who had presided over all his Christmases past. The Nativity Festival that Arlesians called Calendo was a time to celebrate family, both living and departed. Only the poorest homeless wretches spent the holiday alone. But in his agitated state, Vincent needed no special prompting to conjure his disapproving father. In the weeks before Christmas, he spun yet another illusory plan to reverse the judgments of the past. Once again, it involved the approval of his nemesis, H.G. Tersteeg, the only man who still carried the torch of the Rayon Noir. Raising the stakes at the Yellow House even higher, Vincent imagined using Gauguin's recent successes to recruit Tersteeg's support for a joint exhibition in London. Thus, in a single stroke, he could placate the implacable Gérard and put to rest his spectral holiday visitor. But fantasies of redemption were not enough. In the week before Christmas, tortured by Gauguin's success and his own continued failure, terrified that Gauguin might leave and Theo might abandon him at any moment, and besieged by the usual demons of the season, Vincent withdrew to his studio in search of consolation. Over the next few days, an image took shape on his easel that had been gestating in his imagination since the previous summer. Madame Roulin and her infant, Marcel. Since his own childhood of babies and cradles in a crowded parsonage, Vincent had been transfixed by the eternal tableau of mother and child. What Michelet called the absolute beauty and goodness, the acme of perfection. In the apartment that he shared with Sian Hornick, he fawned over his make-believe children and was overtaken with emotion at the sight of Sian bending over the cradle, an image that he rendered again and again. Whether contemplating a favorite print, describing a visit with Kay Vos and her son, or painting a domestic scene in Paris, the image of mother and child invariably caused his eyes to grow moist and his heart to melt. When he moved into the yellow house in September, he planned to decorate his sturdy bedstead with the image of a child in a cradle. In the 5 months since Marcel's birth, Vincent had painted the matronly Augustine several times, with and without her baby. When the photograph of his own mother arrived in September, his ambition redoubled. By mid-December, he had painted the postman's wife so many times that her patience for the strange painter from the north had apparently reached its limit. Vincent had to launch his latest attempt by tracing one of his previous portraits. Layering his own family longings onto the ubiquitous image of the Holy Family, especially the Virgin and Child that gazed beatifically from every shrine and festival and fireside flesh in Provence. He filled a big canvas with the most consoling image he could imagine. As one whom his mother comforteth, he had written from England in 1876, at another moment of existential dread, so I will comfort you, saith the Lord. In Isleworth, he had poured his heartbreak not into art but into sermons. The journey of our life goes from the loving breast of our mother on earth to the arms of our Father in heaven, and into thousands of lines of poetry carefully transcribed into the guest book of Annie Slade Jones, another paragon of maternal fecundity and comfort. In 1882, abandoned by family and friends, he had dreamed a reverie of Sian and her newborn as that eternal poetry of Christmas night with the infant in the stable, a light in the darkness, a brightness in the middle of a dark night. Just as he had turned Patience Escalier into a rustic saint and himself into a bonze priest, he slowly transformed the coarse, harried postman's wife into an icon of motherhood. The great mountain of her bosom he rendered in flowing curves and full fruit-like ripeness. He clothed her in a simple buttoned bodice, not the flimsy, wrinkled frock of previous portraits. He raised her forehead to match the virgins of his memory, and slimmed her formidable jowls and prominent chin to a maidenly point. He transformed her lips from the raw flesh of previous attempts to a bright ruby red, and made her eyes sparkle with irises of a sublime, otherworldly green. Her hair, before always loosely swept up and tousled by labor, now formed into a crown of braids as perfect as a porcelain figurine. He filled this Daumier cartoon of indomitable provincial maternity with the most consoling palette he could devise. A lullaby of colors, he called it. For the bodice, a deep and somber green, accented at the cuffs and collar with the tenderest baby blue. The broad, high-waisted skirt, light green against the earth-red chair and vermilion floor. A graduated scale of contrasts calculated to soothe the eye, not jolt it. As an impressionist arrangement of colors, he wrote, I have never devised anything better. For the face, he worked and reworked yellows and pinks to give her countenance light and life. and he crowned her with a halo of orange and yellow hair, like his own, the shining Delacroix nimbus that marked all his attempts to render the ultimate consolation of Christ. In this simple portrait, Vincent summed up a lifetime of comforting imagery. From the Rembrandt etching of a candlelit cradle that had hung in the Zundert parsonage and in the Schenkweg studio, to a Carlo Dolce Gethsemane, to his own Starry Night, all images that had showed him a light in the darkness at times of crisis. He saw in it both Daumier's simple truth and Corot's ineffable magic. He claimed it as a vindication for both his long love of types and his belief that portraits of everyday people ranked among the most sacred icons of the sublime. He championed it as a promise of artistic procreativity, a midi fertility goddess that ensured the Yellow House would not be counted among the entreprises sans issue. The painting also resurrected the dream of The Hague, of magazine illustrations and of lithographic prints, the dream of reaching out directly to the masses, bypassing the hostile world of galleries and dealers, including his brother, to touch the hearts of the common people who hungered for his heartbroken art. Comparing his maternal talisman to a chromolithograph
Queen of Wands
from a
from
cheap
Tarot the
shop,
Pomegranate.
he imagined it bringing the consoling gospel of color into their colorless lives, just as it had into his. As always, Vincent bolstered his arguments with images from his reading. And Tolstoy called for a return to a more humble, more human religion, more like the simple faith of primitives. And didn't that simpler faith demand a earthy for sainthood in this new religion? Tolstoy, a memorable exemplar of uncomplicated faith and naivete, the very image of Vincent's stolid Earth Mother with her crude form and almanac color. Zola's mystical Le Rêve, which Vincent read that fall, echoed the same theme of rustic faith and secular sainthood in a story of medieval craftsmen seeking the sublime through their simple handiwork. Vincent gave his Byzantine icon the title La Berceuse, a term that applied to both the maternal figure who rocks the cradle and the lullaby she sings. He claimed that the image had been inspired by the great spinner of simple myths, Pierre Loti. In Pêcheur l'Islande, Icelandic fisherman, Loti had described a faience figurine of the Virgin Mary that accompanied the brave fishermen on their perilous voyages in the cold and violent North Atlantic. Affixed to the wall of the ship's cabin, this earthenware mother, painted in the most naive style, heard the seamen's rough prayers, calmed their lonely distress, protected them through wind and storm, and rocked them to sleep at night in the cradle of their boat. If one were to put this canvas just as it is in a fishing boat, Vincent boasted of his new portrait, even one from Iceland, there would be some among the fishermen who would feel they were there inside the cradle. The fisherman Vincent most wanted to comfort with his brightly colored berceuse was his housemate Gauguin, who claimed to have visited Iceland in his merchant marine days and still wore the sailor's beret described in Pêcheur. Vincent had noted Gauguin's affinity with Loti's fishermen the moment he arrived. From its subject matter to its painting style, La Berceuse pleaded for Gauguin to stay in Arles. Like the Folies ball, the image of the postman's wife recaptured a moment of solidarity when Vincent and his guest had worked side by side in the front room of the Yellow House with Augustine Rollin as their shared model. Vincent imagined that Gauguin had, in fact, sired his icon of fecundity. He and I were talking about the fishermen of Iceland and of their mournful isolation, exposed to all dangers, alone on the sad sea, he reported. Following those intimate talks of ours, the idea came to me to paint a picture in such a way that sailors, who are at once children and martyrs, seeing it in the cabin of their Icelandic fishing boat, would feel the old sense of being rocked come over them, and remember their own lullabies. His brush took up the argument, using Gauguin's heavy outlines, flat texture, and careful gradations of color. He borrowed elements from Gauguin's portrait and grandly seated his Madame Roulin in Gauguin's throne-like chair. Now, working entirely du tête, he filled in the ground with Gauguin's unbroken vermilion, and, despite the temptation presented by vast stretches of color, reined in his impetuous hand to prevent any hint of impasto from undermining his hope for reconciliation. On the wall behind the figure, that hope burst in great blooms of color as Vincent filled more than half the canvas with flowered wallpaper. Sprays of pink dahlias, the same flower that bedecked the doomed scene of his mother and sister in the parsonage garden at Eton, burst against a blue-green background, a reverie of the wallpaper in his attic room in Zundert, speckled with orange and ultramarine in an ardent tribute to Cloisonnist ornament. To enchant his simple figure with Gauguin-like mystery, Vincent planned not to depict the infant Marcel, but only to suggest her presence by showing Augustine holding the rope that she used to rock the cradle. Her grip on the rope, firm yet tender, would capture the symbolist essence of the magical mother-child bond. It would be, in short, a triumph of Gauguin's elliptical imagery. But once again, Vincent's draftsmanship failed him. As he worked and reworked every other part of the big canvas in the week before Christmas, the icon's hands remained unfinished. Vincent must have blamed the roadblock on his lack of models.
Finish the first layer of wax on here.
Presented a special challenge for
I'll
an
be
artist
dipping
who
it
always
in
had trouble with
dye.
hands, and he could hardly model
Then doing
the
another
pose
layer
himself.
wax and then another dip
But
in
as
the
the yellow
dye.
house spun deeper and deeper into
Let's do
delirium,
the sleeves.
and his own grip on reality grew more and more uncertain, the unfinished hands on his easel,
So
no
this
doubt,
part is
assumed in Vincent's fevered imagination
the
a
hand
larger
and
and
the
darker significance.
cup right here.
Surrounded by
It's on the
celebrations of
sleeve right
family
here,
and images
so
of belonging, he was losing the battle for connection,
It's a labyrinth,
both in the world
dripping
and within himself.
wine
Without a
into
rope holding
this
him
chalice.
he would suffer the same fate as the poor seaman who trusted Loti's faience
Or
virgin.
pomegranate juice,
Their
whatever.
boat capsized in a storm, and all aboard perished. Vincent's efforts, too, came to grief. On December 23, the last Sunday before Christmas, the moment he had long feared finally arrived. Whether Gauguin intended to leave Arles when he walked out of the Yellow House that evening isn't clear, but Vincent thought he did. In the previous few days, their life together had become unbearable. Bad weather had trapped them both inside. Vincent obsessing over his strange portrait of Madame Roulin, Gauguin idle and restless. When not working, Vincent spent his days in rambling arguments punctuated by outbursts of temper and voids of brooding silence. Gauguin, finally convinced of his host's true madness, worried that at any moment a fatal and tragic attack might imperil his own safety, especially at night when Vincent roamed the house menacingly. "I have been living with my nerves on edge," he reported to Bernard. Gauguin may have left that evening just to get some air between downpours, or to dull his misery at the nearby Café de la Gare, or to visit a favorite prostitute in the brothel district across the Place Lamartine. All escapes he had sought more often as the pressures built up in the Yellow House. He and Vincent had been arguing fiercely over newspaper reports about a famous Jack the Ripper-style killer who, while awaiting execution, was haunted by Horla-like nightmares. Whatever Gauguin's reasons for leaving, Vincent heard the door close and thought it was for the last time. Gauguin had barely reached the middle of the park before he heard familiar footsteps behind him. "Vincent ran after me," Gauguin recalled to a friend a few days later. I turned around, for he had been very strange recently, and I did not trust him. You are going to leave? Vincent demanded. Yes, Gauguin replied. He may have meant only to reaffirm his ultimate intention, already well known to Vincent, or, unnerved by the threatening pursuit, he may have felt a sudden urgent resolve to escape. Either way, Vincent took it as the final verdict he had long expected, and he came armed with a response. Without saying a word, he handed Gauguin a story torn from the day's newspaper, and pointed to the last line. Le meurtrier a pris la fuite. The murderer has fled. Gauguin turned and walked on. He heard Vincent running away into the darkness. No one knows what happened next. Vincent's previous breakdowns left traces in his letters, trails of thoughts and images that followed his descents and recorded his crashes. In Drenthe, the desolate heath, regret over Sienne, dwindling paint supplies, and snatches of disconsolate poetry limned a path toward the disastrous psychotic episode of September 1883. Less than 3 years later, in Antwerp, a diagnosis of syphilis, the indignity of rotting teeth, the deception of his brother, the ridicule of prostitutes and models, and ubiquitous images of death and madness marked his spiral toward the abyss of absolute breakdown. In both places, dismal weather, stubborn poverty, and abusive drinking combined to wear down Vincent's defenses against despair. In this heightened nervous state, even the slightest insult or setback could trigger apocalypse. 3 years later, in Arles, it struck again. He said little about the attack, his word, this time. He professed to remember nothing about it except Horla-like mental fevers and terrible hallucinations. As before, the stage was set. It had been raining for days in Arles, a cold winter rain. Vincent had been drinking again, too, not just wine and cognac, but the far more potent absinthe. After his confrontation with Gauguin in the square, he may well have fled to a cafe for a glass or two of the green consolation. And he was broke again. At one point that day, he reached into his pocket and found only a pitiful handful of change, 1 louis and 3 sous, reminding him not only of his poverty at that moment, but of all the tens of thousands of francs Theo had sent over the years, all now gone. The images swirling in his head on a Sunday night 2 days before Christmas included Maupassant's diabolical Horla, Dickens' haunted Redlaw, Loti's drowned sailors, and especially the ghost of the man who dominated every Sunday and every Christmas of his life. All images of guilt, fear, failure, and death. When he returned to the darkened, empty, yellow house that night, he saw the detritus of his dream everywhere. On the walls, in the accusatory faces of the bonnes, the zouaves, patience escalier, and all the rest of his rejected invitations to the magical South. On his easel, in the unforgiving, unfinishable Berceuse, now repudiated by the one man it was meant to please. In the past, Vincent had always managed to pull himself out of the abyss. In the Borinage, by imagining a new life of artistic brotherhood with Theo. In Drenthe, by inviting Theo to join him on the heath. In Antwerp, by laying plans to join Theo in Paris. By Christmas 1888, however, all these routes of escape had been foreclosed. 2 years of living together had almost killed his brother, and the weight of guilt had almost crushed him. Even now, the cautionary example of the Zamgano brothers, who separated in order to survive, still weighed on his conscience. He had left Paris to save Theo. He could not go back. Nor would Theo come to him. Whatever remained of that fantasy had been put to rest by the painful transfer of Theo's favor from Vincent's hopeless enterprise in the Midi to the Entresol's new star, Gauguin. By December 23, news had reached Arles that only confirmed the abandonment Vincent already felt. Theo had proposed to Yo Bonger. The two had reunited again in Paris, apparently at Yo's initiative, and sought their parents' permission to marry. If the announcement did not wound him, the secrecy of their whirlwind courtship surely did. Vincent had always suspected that, in the end, Gauguin would be drawn away from the Yellow House by his wife and family. Now, for the same reasons, he knew Theo would never come. Shipwrecked, with no hope of rescue, delirious, disoriented, and probably drunk, he stumbled to his bedroom. He went to the corner where the washstand stood. From there, he could see into Gauguin's room, which was still empty. When he turned around, he looked into the mirror that hung over the washstand. Instead of the familiar face he had painted dozens of times, he saw a stranger, an ill-starred wretch who had failed his family, killed his father, bled his brother of money and health, destroyed his dream of a studio in the South, and driven away his belle amie. The failure was too overwhelming. The crime was too great. It had to be punished. But how? Vincent had spent a lifetime inflicting discomfort
Battery's
and pain
going
on
dead
the
on the
image in the
phone.
mirror, from refusing food
Almost done
to
with
sleeping on the
this. Now I'm
ground in
doing this
freezing
this
huts
sleeve.
and beating himself with cudgels. But this crime demanded more.
This part here,
His
the
fevered
wand that
mind
she's holding,
swam with
Queen of
images
Wands.
of punishments exacted for sin, from the sword wounds inflicted by the apostles on Christ's attackers at Gethsemane, to the brutal exorcisms of Zola's La Rêve and mutilations in La Terre and Germinal. The traitorous brother who dragged Zola's hero from the Paradis garden had had his ear chopped off. Vincent picked up the straight razor that lay on the washstand and opened it. He grabbed the criminal's ear and pulled at the lobe as hard as he could. He brought his arm across his face and slashed at the offending flesh. The razor missed the upper ear, coming down at about the midpoint and slicing through to the jaw. The skin cut easily, but the rubbery gristle of cartilage demanded either savagery or persistence before the flesh between his fingers came loose. By then, his arm was covered in blood. Jolted into reality, he tried almost immediately to stanch the fierce arterial bleeding. The amount of blood must have surprised him as he scurried to the kitchen in search of more towels, leaving a trail of crimson through the hall and studio. By the time the bleeding slowed, his mind was possessed by a new delusion. He would find Gauguin and show him the awful price that had been paid. Perhaps then he would reconsider. Vincent washed the small fan of flesh and carefully wrapped it, like a cut of meat, in a piece of newspaper. He dressed his wound and covered the bandage with tape, then set off into the darkness. 24 hours before Christmas, on a rainy night, there were only a few places Gauguin could be. Vincent probably tried the brothels first. Gauguin's favorite, on the Rue des Boudards, was only a few minutes' walk from the Yellow House. Vincent asked to see Gabby, the nom de théâtre of a woman named Rachel, Gauguin's particular favorite. But the brothel keeper would not let him pass. Convinced, perhaps, that Gauguin was within, he surrendered his package to the sentry and asked him to convey it with a message. Remember me. He returned to the Yellow House, staggered up to his bloody bedroom, lay down dizzily on the scarlet blanket, and closed his eyes, expecting, even welcoming, the worst. Chapter 37. Two Roads. Theo couldn't believe his good fortune. Yo had finally said yes. 18 months after rejecting his marriage proposal, she had miraculously re-entered his life and, in a whirlwind 2 weeks, transformed it. On December 21, Theo announced the great news to his mother, giving her the possible Christmas present. We have seen one another a great deal these last few days, he wrote. She has told me she loves me too, and that she will take me the way I am. Oh, Mother, I am so inexpressibly happy. His family celebrated the news with the holiday endorsements. What good news! We are so happy with it, Sister Bill responded. I'm so thankful that you won't be alone anymore because you're not that type of person. We have been wishing it for you for such a long time, Lise added. His mother thanked the good Lord for hearing my prayer. On Christmas Eve, Theo laid plans with Yo to travel to Holland and formally announce their engagement to both families. This will be a turning point in my life, he predicted. I am on cloud 9. Later the same day, a courier arrived at the gallery with a telegram from Arles. Vincent had fallen gravely ill. Theo needed to come at once. Gauguin offered few details. Theo imagined the worst. Oh, may the suffering I dread be staved off, he scrawled in a note to Yo as he hurried out the door. I shall keep my spirits up by thinking of you. At 7:15 that evening, as Christmas Eve candles, lamps, and electric lights were lit across Paris, he boarded a train for the 450-mile trip to Arles, a trip he had long avoided. Yo bid him farewell at the station. On Christmas morning, the hospital in Arles was unusually empty. Staff and visitors and any patients who could walk filled the churches of Catholic Provence, one of them attached directly to the hospital, or joined family at home. Built in the 16th and 17th centuries, when any illness was a deadly, demonic business, the hospital looked like a prison, with high stone walls pierced by small windows and few entries. Its builders had given it a name, carved over the main door, at once hopeful and helpless. Hôtel Dieu, God's house. Reminders of its spiritual license, crucifixes, plaques, inscriptions, filled the cavernous halls as Theo searched for his brother. He may have stopped first at the Yellow House, near the station, and asked Gauguin to be his guide. If he did, Gauguin refused. Vincent had called out for his housemate many times after he regained consciousness, hoping to dissuade him from doing what he had already done, summon Theo. With so few staff and so many beds, finding Vincent could not have been easy. Since arriving 24 hours earlier, he may have already been removed from the fever ward, a huge, high-ceilinged room with dozens of beds separated by muslin curtains. The police had left him there, bleeding and unconscious, the previous morning. But when he regained consciousness, he cried out incomprehensibly in a tumble of Dutch and French that unnerved both patients and staff. Eventually, they moved him to an isolation cell, a tiny room with padded walls, barred windows, and a bed fitted with shackles. By the time Theo found him, he had calmed down again and may have been returned to the ward, a round trip he would make many times. He seemed to be all right at first, Theo reported to Yo. At one point, he lay down in the bed beside his brother, and they reminisced about their childhood together in the attic of the Zundert parsonage. How poignant, their mother wrote when Theo related the scene to her. Together on a pillow. Theo asked if Vincent approved of his plan to marry Yo. Vincent replied elusively, "Marriage ought not to be regarded as the main object in life." But before long, the demons descended again. He lapsed into brooding about philosophy and theology, Theo reported. It was terribly sad. From time to time, all his grief would well up
First
inside,
layer
and
is
he would
done
try
on
to
the
weep, but
front.
couldn't. If only Vincent had someone like Yo, Theo thought. Poor fighter,
Doing the
and
back.
poor sufferer, he wrote her after his visit. Had he just once found someone to whom he could pour his heart out, it might never have come to this. And then he left. After no more than a few hours at the hospital, with only a brief visit to the Yellow House, he returned to the station and took a train that left Arles at 7:30 that evening, only 9 hours after he arrived. He was probably accompanied on the long ride back to Paris by Gauguin, who carried a load of Vincent's paintings as trophies of his 2 months in Arles. Struggling to explain his hasty flight from Vincent's bedside, Theo wrote Yo. His suffering is deep and hard for him to bear, but nothing can be done to relieve his anguish now. In his brief time at the hospital, Theo managed to speak to one doctor, a 23-year-old intern named Felix Ray. As the most junior member of the medical staff, Ray had drawn the short straw of holiday duty. An affable Midi native, Ray had yet to earn his medical degree, but he could report to Theo the strange circumstances of Vincent's accident and the agony of his long first day in the hospital. All of the doctors at the Hôtel Dieu were astonished and perplexed by Vincent's case. The violence of his attack on himself, the vehemence of his agitation, the strangeness of his behavior. Not one of them had yet dared to propose a diagnosis. Clearly, his mind was unmoored. Anyone could see that. His wound and his fever they could treat, but some were already declaring him insane and urging his transfer to a lunatic asylum, where he could receive more expert attention. Ray, who was just completing his doctoral thesis on urinary tract infections, knew little about mental illness, but he brightly ventured his own reassuring prognosis to the patient's distraught brother. Vincent was merely suffering from overexcitement, he said, the natural product of an extremely hypersensitive personality. The symptoms would soon abate, he predicted confidently. He will be himself again in a few days. If Theo had stayed in Arles another day, he might have met the hospital's medical director or administrator and heard other, more dire opinions. But formal interviews would have entailed wrenching inquiries into family health secrets, both physical and mental, a routine part of the admitting process that both brothers dreaded. Vincent's hospital records contained none of the background information that Theo could have provided. Ray's opinion may have been hasty, inexperienced, or inexpert, but it gave Theo what he wanted most: permission to return to Paris. Just as his old life threatened to end, a new one beckoned. The prospect of losing my brother, he wrote Yo, made me realize what a terrible emptiness I would feel if he were no longer there. And then I imagined you before me. It was a pattern that would be repeated again and again over the next 5 months as Vincent shuttled in and out of the hospital, in and out of padded cells, in and out of coherence. One brother suffering in silence and self-reproach, the other retreating into optimism and indecision. One haunted by the past, the other looking to the future. Both grasping at every straw of hope, minimizing every dread, moving in contrary spirals of denial that pushed them further and further apart with each revolution. Let's not exhaust ourselves in futile attempts at mutual generosity, Vincent wrote in a moment of grim clarity and resignation after Theo left. You do your duty, and I will do mine. And at the end of the road, perhaps we will meet again. As soon as news of Theo's departure pierced his consciousness, Vincent plunged into darkness again. Vincent remembered little about his attacks. I don't know anything about what I said, what I wanted, or what I did, he wrote. But he remembered the darkness. It descended without warning. In an instant, the veil of time and the fatality of circumstances seemed to be torn apart, he said, as if he had suddenly and inexplicably disappeared from the world. A witness at the hospital who saw him during an attack described him as lost. In the darkness, nameless fears overwhelmed him. He felt waves of anguish and terror and horrible fits of anxiety. He lashed out violently at the threats he saw everywhere, raging incoherently at doctors and chasing away anyone who approached his bed. When his rage was spent, he retreated to a corner or under the covers,
Done. I'm
and
just gonna
cowered
sign
in
this
fevers
piece.
of indescribable mental anguish. He trusted no one, recognized no
Queen of
one,
Wands.
doubted everything he heard or saw, took no food, could not sleep, would not write, and refused to talk. In the darkness, shapeless shadows pursued him. Horla, like ghosts, unbearable hallucinations, appeared and disappeared like vapor, but as vivid and palpable as his own flesh. During the crises themselves, he wrote, I thought that everything I imagined was real. They spoke to him. They accused him of terrible
Oh, my
crimes.
kitty is
They
snoring.
called him a
Oh,
deplorable and melancholy failure, a weak
Behind
character,
me.
a miserable wretch. He shouted back, desperately defending himself against the thin air, but he could not make himself heard. After a lifetime of arguing and persuading, he was trapped in his worst nightmare, a prisoner at the bar, gagged into silence. I cried out so much during the attacks, he recalled. I wanted to defend myself and couldn't do it. The unanswered accusations sent him spiraling into seizures of self-loathing and
I'm gonna put
atrocious
these
remorse.
2 pieces.
Vincent never identified his
sun.
phantom accusers, but in his hours of frightful suffering, when I was so far gone that it was
Penguins
more than
and
a
their
swoon,
first dye
he called
bath.
out names. Degas,
Thank you for
whose
joining me.
easy, elegant lines eluded him. Gauguin, whose refusal
I thought
to
my
stay
phone's
in
dying, but thank you for
confirmed the
joining me.
failure of his great meaty dream.
Peace.
Theo, who came to Arles too late, and for all the
I don't know
wrong
how to
reasons.
shut this thing off.
And of course, the damning parson, who relentlessly tallied every failure and spied from every crucifix.